Locations.
So in SANDBAG, we have cards called locations, which are basically, imagine if you had field spells in your extra deck. And for Yu-Gi-Oh players who love the extra deck but think it's a little bit too complicated, or love field spells but you feel like field spells just don't come up enough, locations are basically both combined in a very simple way that is not game breaking in any way. It just makes the game more interesting.
Reason 2. Creature types.
So just like Yu-Gi-Oh in SANDBAG, we have both creature types right here. This is a machine, and we have archetypes. So for those of you who really love that kind of double interaction, you would love SANDBAG because we've got cards like this that say, if you have a card with the archetype of Hacienda, like an Ascendant Mech, for example, then you can play a machine without paying the cost. So there's this entire deck is built around machines and ascending cards. And then we have this structure deck is built around soldiers. It's just all about soldiers, not even around any archetype. You've got this deck, which is for those of you who really like those kind of archetypes that kind of have a mix of different creature types.
Reason 3. Techs.
If you're a big fan of hand traps in Yu-Gi-Oh, or just traps in general, in SANDBAG we have techs, which are really similar to hand traps basically, but there's a very limited amount of them, which means that they're not super confusing and you don't have all this kind of run over, and they're all really staple cards, so everybody can be really familiar with them. They're great access. You've got Shield and you've got Ricochet Railgun, and they have the same activation timing, which is basically when your opponent attacks. So they're really they bring that aspect of kind of trap cards, but they introduce a different side of it by making it a little bit more accessible.
Reason 4. Speed.
So if you're looking at a card from SANDBAG, you'll probably realize that unlike Yu-Gi-Oh, SANDBAG cards have 3 stats. I mean, you could consider a level in Yu-Gi-Oh to be a stat, but we have 3 stats. So not only do we have attack right here as the first number, but we also have speed and defense. Kind of similar to Yu-Gi-Oh, we've got that attack and the defense. Defense and attack are a little bit different in SANDBAG than they are in Yu-Gi-Oh, but speed is this whole other mechanic that allows a card to attack your opponent, effectively attacking them directly under certain conditions. The faster your creature is, the higher chance it has to just bypass all the creatures your opponent has and attack them directly, giving this whole new dimension to the game and adding more stats, which allows for vanillas to be a little bit more interesting. It allows for all this kind of different interactions. And so if you're really a big fan of cards in Yu-Gi-Oh that can attack directly, SANDBAG has an entire mechanic about it.
Reason 5. Simplicity.
So SANDBAG still is actually in a fairly early format, and a lot of the cards are very simple, as well as the game being really simple. This is honestly about as complicated as a card gets. Honestly, probably the most complicated card in the game is Ricochet Railgun, which is still not even that complicated. So if you're really interested in playing a game with a little bit more simple cards than Yu-Gi-Oh's big text long cards that are really interesting but a little bit maybe overcomplicated, SANDBAG is great for that. And because it's really simple, it's also easy to get into.
Reason 6. Online access.
So right now we're looking at handmade, physical cards, but SANDBAG is actually primarily an online game, similar to, in some ways, Yu-Gi-Oh, which I know that something I really loved about Yu-Gi-Oh was that kind of accessibility with Yu-Gi-Oh Master Duel and all sorts of games like Yu-Gi-Oh Duel Links, which I know has different rules, but is also a really fun online game. And so then Yu-Gi-Oh has all this kind of online access, which allows people to get into it. Similarly, SANDBAG has great online access, and all you have to do, if you're interested in the game, is subscribe to this channel for more content, or you can just take a look at my other videos. If you're curious, you can play the game on Untapped.in, which is an online simulator where you can actually play Yu-Gi-Oh as well, by the way. And you can even just, go to the Discord link in the description, where you can copy and paste that and join a Discord server to find opponents and join the community.
Reason 7. No summon limit.
So in Yu-Gi-Oh, you have a summon limit, right? Unless you're playing Yu-Gi-Oh Rush Duel. But you have special summons to kind of make up for that, right? But in SANDBAG, you actually don't have a summon limit, meaning you can play as many cards as you want in a turn and do all sorts of fun stuff without these limitations. And that means you can do a big, nice combo without having any sort of special summons that give you specific advantages that your opponent doesn't have, that are kind of sometimes going to mess up the balance of the game.
Reason 8. Classic Yu-Gi-Oh style cards.
A lot of cards in SANDBAG are actually kind of similar to classic Yu-Gi-Oh! So if you're a big fan of the older formats in Yu-Gi-Oh! Or just really love the anime, we have cards like Ascended Mech, which are kind of like, like a Blue Eyes White Dragon or something. You discard 2 creatures from play to play it, which is kind of like tributing 2 monsters. We've also got complete vanillas like Paradigm Patrol Bot. And these cards all are completely relevant because of having 3 different stats, which gives it more complexity, and also just these cards are all really cool and fun, and I've managed to make it in SANDBAG work out to have these kind of basically vanilla cards.
Reason 9. Casual play.
Warning, unsleeved Yu-Gi-Oh cards. If you're a Yu-Gi-Oh player, you are probably familiar with having something like this, where it's just a full deck of cards, of Yu-Gi-Oh cards that were just kind of like a fun combination of cards that you happen to have, and you tried to put them together and make a deck, and it seemed pretty good at the time. Maybe some of the cards are a little bit outdated or whatever. But what you've probably experienced is that, some of the cards are useful, some of them aren't useful, but in the end, they're great for a casual format, right? You can say to somebody, "Oh, hey, I want to play a game with this card in my deck," and "Oh, it's a fun deck that I've built here. Can we just play a game? I want to just play a game with my casual cards that I just happen to have." And you might notice in a lot of other trading card games that it doesn't really exist. Like if you take Pokemon, they've got kind of these monster types that really, or I guess Pokemon types you'd say, they really get in the way, because you can't all of a sudden just take 100 random Pokemon cards and build a deck, because they don't have energies, and you're like, what is this? In Yu-Gi-Oh, I could just take a bunch of random cards and build a deck, even if it's not that great. I could find some interesting interactions between cards. I could find ways to get out these cards from my extra deck. I can do stuff, right? And so SANDBAG, very similar to Yu-Gi-Oh like that. You can pick up just a bunch of random SANDBAG cards. On untapped.in, there's actually a cube feature, so you can play with random cards, or you can do what I know I used to do as a kid, just pick up a structure deck and start playing with it.
Reason 10. Discard pile based mechanics.
So ironically, the Yu-Gi-Oh deck I was just showing was Lightsworn's, but one of the things I loved about Yu-Gi-Oh, and honestly that I love about trading card games in general, is all these discard pile related mechanics, and SANDBAG has them as well. You've got an entire structure deck built around the discard pile. That's the Terran one. And you've got basically both of the techs, which are really important cards. They relate to the discard pile. This removes 10 cards from your discard pile. Imagining basically this is like banishing 10 cards from your discard pile as an activation cost. You've got Shield, which can actually activate from your discard pile as an additional activation. This entire, the namesake of the game, this entire mechanic of a SANDBAG is basically just cards that activate when they're discarded, or perhaps not when they're discarded, but maybe just from the discard pile.
Reason 11. Fun staples.
Honestly, this is so subjective, but I feel like the staples in SANDBAG, cards like Shield, Ricochet Railgun, here's another staple, Paradigm Y01, which is a location, are all some really fun staples. A lot of them are just based around increasing consistency or doing something that's really important basically for the game's functionality. And so I just personally feel like the staples are really fun staples, which means that it's not really a problem that they're staples. And if I may, I think that some of the staples in Yugioh are maybe not as fun. Cards like Ash Blossom, just, I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm being subjective here, but I do think that the staples in Sandbag are really fun.
Reason 12. Equipping cards.
If you're a big fan of equip spells or the union mechanic in Yu-Gi-Oh, well, we have some really similar cards to that. Terran Drone is basically a union card. It can equip to one of your creatures and it gives that creature some extra stat buffs. And we have this Sandbag that can equip from your discard pile to a creature and give it a buff, which I think is honestly maybe even a little bit more interesting than your average equip card.
Reason 13. Board limits.
So if you like Yu-Gi-Oh, then you're definitely familiar with the fact that in Yu-Gi-Oh you have a limit of like 5 monsters, or in some cases 6. With link monsters, if you get an extra link, maybe 7. Or, there are situations where you can even have a 3-card monster limit if you're playing with a different rule set like Speed Duel, or there are ways that you can reduce monster zones. Sandbag is a lot more simple than that. You have 3 monster zones, or creature zones, since we call them creatures in Sandbag. And I think if you've played Speed Duel, then you may or may not agree with me, but I feel like the 5 zones or 6 zones, however many zones in Yu-Gi-Oh can be a little bit overwhelming. So in Sandbag, it's really simple and easy. And also, in Yu-Gi-Oh, I don't know if you've ever been like, oh, I just wish that there were boss monsters that were more relevant. And like, I wish that it was like, oh, that format in Yu-Gi-Oh, that you love that format where it was kind of like, or I guess there wasn't really a format, but it was like a thing in the anime to have like this boss card. Well, look at this. In Sandbag, you're actually incentivized to just have 1 creature, because at the end of your turn, if you have 1 creature, you get to draw 2 cards, which it adds this whole new level of like, I'm going to play this boss card and it's going to be my boss. And I'm not going to like play like 5 boss cards like in Yu-Gi-Oh, which just, it's not what was advertised. Come on, Yu-Gi-Oh.
Reason 14. Fun boss cards.
So on the topic of boss cards, Sandbag has all sorts of fun boss cards. You've got nice little simple boss cards that are kind of easy to summon. There's all sorts of different like levels of boss cards depending on how easy to summon they are. There's a lot of variety in how easy cards are to play actually. Kind of similar to how like link monsters can have a very big variety on how easy they are to summon. And so there's really a big variety. Some of them are actually different kinds of boss cards. They're more like a boss card based on how much effort or like late game you need to do to really use them to their full potential. Cards like Rising Angel or Very Old Squirrel, which this one might actually trigger some Yu-Gi-Oh players. This might interest you, pique your interest. It does do some pretty crazy stuff. There are all sorts of different really interesting boss cards in Sandbag, and they're really actually pretty easy to play. And so boss cards are a fun thing in Yu-Gi-Oh that I loved, and I know that in Yu-Gi-Oh there's a little bit of that concern of, oh, everybody can play my boss card. In Sandbag, that is also true to some extent, I will admit, but there are also boss cards that are legitimately kind of locked to your archetype, like Rising Angel.
Reason 15. Back and forth.
So in Yu-Gi-Oh, one of the most exciting things, right, is when you have that game that just every single turn it seems to be switching who's in the lead. They keep making their comebacks, right? And Sandbag is actually a lot like that because of its attack and defense system. So look at the stats on these creatures, right? These creatures actually both are capable of destroying each other, because in Sandbag, there's no like attacking back, but basically on your turn when you attack something, if your attack is greater than or equal to its defense, you destroy that target. And what that means is, because a lot of cards have like kind of high defense and attack, a lot of time it'll actually be a kind of situation where you're just trading like boss cards, right? This Revived Dragon can take out this Lunamasigan mech. Lunamasigan Mech can similarly take out Revived Dragon. You can go back and forth for a long time. Then you have, in the later game, Rising Angel could become really strong. You might be able to take out Lunamasigan Mech. Your opponent might be able to take it out again. So there's all sorts of potential for really great back and forth action in Sandbag.
Reason 16. No negates.
I mean, I'm sorry, but like, I know this isn't even really a negate by modern Yu-Gi-Oh standards, but you guys can negate stuff, and I just that really can annoy me sometimes. So I have designed Sandbag to not have any sort of negates except negates that negate attacks. And what that means is you can play the game as easily as you like to, and your opponent won't interfere until you start attacking.
Reason 17. No immunity.
I don't know if I even really have a card with immunity to show to you guys, but like in Yu-Gi-Oh, you know, there are those cards that say like this is unaffected by any effects at all, and then there's always like some way of getting around it, which is always so funny to me. But like Sandbag doesn't have that. There's nothing that's just immune to getting destroyed. Sometimes stuff has such good stats that it's really hard to destroy, but nothing has like, oh, I'm just immune to destruction. And so that means that we don't have these like counters to immunity and counters to counters to immunity and counters to counters to. I know that can be fun for some people, but if that's not fun for you, don't worry, Sandbag doesn't have it.
Reason 18. Game length.
Alright, I'm not going to show a whole game of Sandbag, but take my word for it, it has a very varying length and usually goes on for quite a few turns. The turns are really fast, so it's kind of, if you like Yu-Gi-Oh or dislike Yu-Gi-Oh and you've experienced, oh, Yu-Gi-Oh has that thing where like it's just this one really long turn and that's it. Sandbag is quite the opposite. It's a lot of really short turns.
Reason 19. Early format.
Alright, you've seen this image many times, but you're looking at 4 Sandbag structure decks, which is basically all there is so far. So if you are a fan of the early Yu-Gi-Oh format, in which case I think you might be over-idealizing because there were some issues back then too. Sandbag is an early format as well, and I'd say it still has a bunch of interesting things for you, but the game is going to keep developing. All sorts of new interesting things will come out in the future. So if you're not into Sandbag yet, do stay tuned. And also, you've got that fun of just a simple, easy to get into early format.
Reason 20. For fun.
So yeah, finally, like literally just for fun. Sandbag is a really fun game. And yeah. So if you're interested, please be sure to subscribe or do whatever to just get into the community, have some fun. You unfortunately cannot get your hands on product because I have not, put product on sale or anything, but there is great opportunities to play online and just get interested in the game. Thanks for watching.